you heard Jeremy talk about what's wrong with the ocean and what's at stake. So I'm not going to repeat that. But I want to give you some hope. I want to show something that's working in the ocean to see if we can replicate it, right? Because as Corey said, we have these, humans are so funny. We know that if we do something good now, we'll get a benefit in the future. But humans are very good at discounting the future. So, doing something, sacrificing now a little bit my lifestyle for something that I'm going to see the benefits in 20 or 30 years, I don't think so. And the problem is that our kids are going to have to pay all that debt, all that environmental debt. Is there anything that we can do today that is going to have an impact today, that is going to make us and the ocean more resilient, more able to adapt to what's coming, while the leaders of the world and the regional leaders and the industry leaders figure out how to reduce emissions? And the answer is yes. And there are many things that can happen, but I'm going to show you one. And when we think about what needs to happen to revert that catastrophic trajectory to climate change, there is only one thing that needs to happen, which is reduce dramatically carbon emissions. Period. Everything else, wind farms, reforesting, capturing carbon, are just mechanisms that on the aggregate will get us to that goal. Right? But what can we do today to build resilience, to buy time? And I'm going to show you one example of something that's working in the ocean. And this example is protecting large chunks of the ocean. And these are good news. I guess many people were happy when President Obama declared the first national marine monument off the coast of New England. That was 1 week ago. A month ago, President Obama created the largest protected area on the planet, on the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. That's a big chunk of what the continental United States would be if it were protected. But not everybody was happy. There were a few people who are making a lot of money killing tuna that were opposed. And you always hear this argument: when you protect a place, you are displacing people and you are hurting the industry. According to the Hawaiian tuna fishing industry, the creation of that reserve was going to put the entire US economy at risk. It was going to be a global catastrophe. But the science and the economics prove otherwise. What happens when you protect an area? Well, the science, after many scientific studies, we have agreed that if you don't kill fish, they take a longer time to die. And they grow larger, and they reproduce more. This is what happens when you close an area to fishing. The fish grow a third bigger, and the biomass, the amount of fish, the kilos, the pounds of fish per square meter, increases by 450%. Find somebody in Wall Street who can give you that rate of return. 450% in less than a decade. Right? So when you protect a place, the ocean comes back spectacularly. The ocean is very resilient. Okay, what about other benefits? When you protect an area, the fish come back, and then the divers come in. There are so many places that are a magnet for the tourism industry. Protected areas are right now the prime destination for tourism. In the Caribbean, for example, half of all scuba diving, all sport diving happens within marine protected areas, and that's a $1.5 billion industry. So jobs are created. The Great Barrier Reef is a great example. There is this big protected area of the east coast of Australia. That area supports 60,000 jobs and brings $5 billion to the Australian economy. $6 billion. That's 50 times more than what fishing brings for all of Australia. So economically, protection can be more beneficial than overexploitation. And then what about the people? What about all these fishermen that we are displacing? Well, the science also shows that when you protect an area, the fish recover so well inside of it, they grow so much, they reproduce so much that some of them spill over the boundaries of these protected areas, and the fishermen benefit. There are examples from Spain, Chile, Mexico, Kenya, Fiji, the Solomon Islands, and many other places. In Kenya, for example, a small marine reserve helped to double the income of the local fishermen only within 3 years, which put them out of poverty. So we know that these reserves also have social benefits. If you think about how much of the ocean is protected, you will believe it. You know, this works. This has social, economic, and ecological benefits. Oh, how much of the ocean is protected like this? Before we get there, there is an extra benefit that we have talked about before here. The resilience. If you protect an area, in principle, you would think that you would make this area more resilient, healthier, more able to adapt to climate change. And this is actually what's happening. You heard about the massive die-offs of corals in the Great Barrier Reef and across the Pacific this year, because we had this very strong El Nino year, big warming event. The corals are bleaching and dying. You've seen these photos that Jeremy showed of entire coral reefs dying and turning into rubble. But there was a story in the New York Times recently about this coral reef coming back in a protected area in the Phoenix Islands, an archipelago in the Central Pacific that is uninhabited and fully protected. Jeremy and I conducted a scientific expedition to a place called Kingman Reef, 1,000 miles south of Hawaii, in 2005. And that was the last stop in a series of surveys we did on islands with 5,000 people, 2,000 people, 900 people, 20 people, and then Kingman Reef, which had no people at all. All of those reefs had been hit by El Nino of 97, 98. Massive bleaching, massive coral die-off, except in the place where we went to that was fully protected. If the corals bleached, they came back. So when we protect a chunk of the ocean, that place is healthier, more resilient, and can help replenish the areas outside. So we have social, ecological, economic benefits, and also these places are helping us to buy time while we figure out how to reduce emissions. Now, how much of the ocean do you think is protected globally today? 2%. Well, thanks to President Obama and Senator Kerry and his ocean conference last week, now we have 3%. It's been a 50% increase in only a month. So 2 years ago, we were at only 1% of the ocean. 2 years ago. Today we're at 3%. And half of this is fully protected in areas without fishing, drilling, mining, development, what we call no-take marine reserves. But how much of the ocean should be protected? Well, there is an agreement of all the nations of the world, including us, that 10% of the ocean should be protected by 2020. More than 140 scientific studies recommend that the target should be 30%. But let's start with the United Nations target, 10%. How are we going to get from the 3% to the 10% in the next 3 years? Well, most of these marine protected areas on the planet are very, very small. In fact, most of the surface protected in the ocean today is within less than 20 giant reserves like the one that President Obama created of Hawaii. But the average size of the reserve is very small. It's less than 100 square kilometers. That's much smaller than Providence. If we had to go from 3 to 10% in the next 3 years through the creation of average-sized marine reserves, we would need 5,600 new protected areas. I don't think this is going to happen. What about replicating these giant marine reserves? There have been proposals that were made last week at our ocean conference by the UK, France, and other countries, Seychelles, Chile. If all of these proposals and commitments by countries were implemented, we would go from 3% to only 6% of the ocean. And these light blue areas are the areas that are now targeted or committed for protection. Only 6%. And this would be through the largest protected areas on the planet. So that's not going to make it either. So we need to look beyond national waters. And there is something called the high seas, the international waters beyond national jurisdiction. These are the waters in dark blue here. Every country owns 200 nautical miles of water, and beyond that, it belongs to everybody and it belongs to nobody. And right now it's like the Wild West. Only 10% of the global fish catch comes from the high seas. Only 10%. And most of it is sharks that go to China, and tuna, and bottom fish like orange roughy or Chilean civet that are sold in rich countries. So the high seas, the international waters, are not necessary to solve the problem of food security globally. And again, it's only 10% of the global catch. High value fish, it goes to Europe, United States, Japan, and China. And 4 countries account for 3/4 of the effort of fishing in the high seas: China, Korea, Japan, and Spain. So what are the economics? If we think about, can we protect large chunks of the high seas? What are the economics we're fighting against? Well, using satellite data of thousands and thousands of boats looking at their trucks over the last 6 years, we've been able to figure out where boats are fishing in the high seas. And this map of color shows you that basically there is almost no ocean left to fish. The places in black around the continents are the exclusive economic zones of countries, so they are outside of this analysis. And in the south, the weather is so rough, the roaring 40s and the Antarctic Ocean, that few vessels there to go there. So our footprint of fishing in international waters is global. There is no ocean left to fish, basically. And the darker the blue in the map, it means the more hours vessels spend fishing in every pixel. Right? So we looked at how much fish are caught, how much revenue these few countries and companies get from fishing in the high seas. And because we were able to analyze the track of every single fishing boat in the high seas for the last 4 years, we were also able to estimate for the first time how much does it cost to fish in the high seas. You'd assume that fishing in the middle of the Atlantic is much more expensive than fishing 20 miles off Providence. Right? So this is what we found. That when you look at the annual profit, net economic benefit of global fishing in the high seas is negative. Without the subsidies, which for the high seas are about $3 billion, without the subsidies from government, from taxpayers, in the same way that $700 billion go to oil subsidies in the US, globally $35 billion go to fisheries subsidies, most of them to perpetuate destructive fishing practices. Of those 35 billion, 3 billion go to the high seas. So without this, if you look at the from an economic perspective, it is rational to fish in the high seas given the subsidies. But without the subsidies, nobody would be fishing beyond waters of national jurisdiction. And then we did something else. We wanted to know, well, what are the opportunities? It's clear that in this case, if fishing is not profitable, well, we have an opportunity to protect areas, right? But the ocean is patchy. Not everybody is fishing everywhere. And we came up with this map that shows in red, these are the areas where fishing is not profitable. And in blue, these are the areas where fishing in the high seas actually makes money. That's before the subsidies, right? So imagine these red areas, they are prime candidates to create huge international parks, like the one we have in Hawaii or off Massachusetts. Create huge international parks that will be fully protected, would allow the fish, all those tuna and other species to recover and help to replenish the exclusive economic zones of countries all around it. And a model shows that if all the high seas were closed to fishing, the fisheries catch, the yield of fishing inside the country's waters would increase by 30%. So we would be catching more fish. We would not need those subsidies. And we would increase the economic profit between 100 and 800%. That's within 5 years. And more countries will benefit, because it's not just 4 countries that monopolize fishing in the high seas. Now, every country that has an exclusive economic zone where these fish migrate to could catch them in their waters. So what we saw for these protected areas that I showed you in the beginning, coastal areas where fish increase, jobs are created, economic profit increases, also happens at the global scale. So this is something, and on top of that, imagine what it would mean for the resilience of the ocean if huge chunks, huge percentages of ocean were protected. What would that mean for the ability of the ocean to adapt, to resist the worst short-term impacts of climate change? So this is what I think we need to do. This is what the ocean will look like with a little over 10% protected, as the UN target says. We need to create these large areas in the high seas that will have global benefits. We need to continue creating these large national monuments within exclusive economic zones of countries in remote areas without people or very few people, with regional benefits. And then, also very important, even though we will not be able to create those 5,600 new coastal protected areas in the next 3 years, we still didn't need those. Now, you need them here in Rhode Island. They need them in Massachusetts. They need them in Maine. Because these are areas that have local benefits, the local fishing industry benefits. If you think about that 97% of the ocean that is open to fishing right now, that's like a bank account where everybody withdraws, but nobody makes a deposit. And you don't need to be I see people nodding, you don't need to be an economist to figure out what's going to happen to that bank account. These reserves, these areas like the national monuments, without exploitation, these are savings accounts. We have a principal set aside that produces interest that we can enjoy and makes us more resilient to climate change. So this is my call to everybody. Through our project at Pristine Seas at National Geographic, we are working with country leaders to help to create these very, very large marine reserves, but also at the local level, local communities. There are great business opportunities that come through the creation of these protected areas that are more beneficial than exploitation in most cases, and also can provide additional revenue and employment for fishermen who see their livelihoods threatened, like Jeremy said before, by climate change, because when the water gets too warm in Maine, how are they going to respond to that? So I wanted to show you today, after the tragedy of climate change and the tragedy of human nature and the constituency of ignorance in this country in the future, that there are actually things that we are doing right now that are working, that benefit everybody, and that we should replicate as often as possible. Thank you. Professor Jackson.
No. So Enric, I went to a wonderful meeting on Monday that was hosted by Jennifer Duquette at the NYU Law School. And there are, in fact, legal instruments in place very clearly to close the entire high seas fisheries if countries wanted to do it. The only thing I think I would change in what you said is I think there are more like 7 or 8 countries that would be the losers in the closing of the high seas, because Taiwan would be a loser as well, and a couple of others. But because, and I think you know this, but I don't think you mentioned it, because most of the commercially important stocks are straddling stocks between the EEZs and the deep sea. What you're talking about is creating a protected area for the fish we most value.
Exactly.
To fish.
Exactly.
So the tuna are in the coastal zones, and the swordfish and all the rest, if we protect them.
Exactly. No, thank you, Jeremy. That's a good clarification. So these 4 countries that I mentioned capture, they account for 3/4 of the effort in the high seas. 7 countries account for 90% of all the catch, right? And imagine the North Atlantic, there are these bluefin tuna that migrate between the Gulf of Mexico, New England, and the Mediterranean, and many of them come back and forth every year. This is what is called straddling stocks. They migrate. Right now, these countries that monopolize fishing in the high seas are basically stealing, paying very little for the access to these global commons. They are stealing those fish that otherwise would end up in the waters of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Florida, North Carolina, etc., or on the other side of the Atlantic. So by protecting everything in between, that bank account would grow with compound interest and produce all this interest that could be enjoyed by Canada, United States, Mexico, and the European countries, instead of being stolen basically by these few countries in the high seas. That's what's so important.
Just a practical question. The United States can afford an excellent Coast Guard that conducts surveillance and enforcement activities within our EEZ. What you're suggesting here is high seas reserves that would require some level of international surveillance, and who would be charged with enforcement? If you say flag state enforcement,
yeah.
We know there are flags for rent everywhere. How would you address that problem?
Yeah, there are 2 solutions that are already in place. One is satellite surveillance. Boats that go beyond 200 miles, they have to be of a reasonable size. And those data that I showed you before have been, this data on effort were analyzed using something called the Global Fishing Watch, which is a system that is now publicly available on a Google platform, where you can track every single fishing boat that has what's called an automatic identification system. It's a pinger, it's a transponder that sends signals to radio frequency. So boats can detect each other on the radars and avoid collisions. These signals are picked up by satellites. And those data that I showed were used using all of the fishing boat tracks on the planet, which is, we estimate, about 30% of the fishing boats, because some of them turn it off when they are fishing. They don't want to be located. But many countries are now making mandatory the use of these identification systems. So these global surveillance systems exist. Now, you catch a boat fishing in a protected area in the high seas. What do? Well, then we have what's called a state port measures agreement, which is an international agreement that has already come into place, ratified by the United States too, where if you don't have a Navy or a Coast Guard and somebody is fishing in your marine reserve, when that boat comes to my port or your port or her port, we're going to enforce it there. So this combination of remote technology that is already operational and international agreements for enforcement, I think that's the solution. Sir?
Sounds good. I was curious with these MPAs, is it your belief that built structures, either submerged or floating, or basically humankind-made structures, can they help or hurt dead zones and reinvigorate dead zones? In other words, I'm concerned if we make everything an MPA, can we place renewable ocean energy devices out there, making a case for these platforms that we impose on the oceans actually could help invigorate that.
Okay, so these are 2 different things. One is the dead zone issue. The dead zone issue, you are not solving the dead zone problem by creating a structure there, because there is no oxygen basically. And dead zones are areas, we have over 500 marine dead zones. These are areas located mostly at the mouths of rivers like the Mississippi River. There's a huge dead zone in front of the Mississippi, because all this fertilizer that comes from agricultural upstream enter the ocean, they fertilize marine waters, you have this huge growth of algae, and then when they die, the bacteria suck up all the oxygen to degrade them. So basically that area, because of this over-fertilization, becomes empty of oxygen. There is no oxygen except some very hard microbes. Nobody else can live, so that's why it's called dead. So if you build a structure there, that's not going to solve the problem. The solution has to come from upstream. Marine protected areas, like these no-take areas, are not incompatible with wind farms. In fact, the European Union had a research project for the last 4 years, it ended last year, that explored the linkages between wind farms and marine reserves. So you should look at that. The report is online. And in some places, and I think it was of Denmark, some studies have shown that these offshore wind farms are actually attracting fish, because these are areas where the big trawlers cannot operate, because it's very risky. So these areas are like the oil areas, usually are areas that are off limits to fishing. So these structures in a bottom that is sandy or muddy offer artificial reefs that would allow for the existence of animals that wouldn't be there otherwise. So any structure in a place that has a bottom with little structure helps. Now, spending millions of dollars in artificially made structures with this honeycomb pattern, whatever, sold to local governments to then sink them near a coral reef, I think that's a really good scam. Yeah. One more question. Yeah, so all these species that you know about, like tuna, for example, or swordfish, or wahoo, grouper. How many of you have eaten grouper? You know, all of you know what a grouper is, right? Cod, which is also not only it has been overfished, but now it's moving farther north because of warming. In the last century, we have killed 90% of them. On average, for some species of sharks, we have killed 99% of them. There are species of sharks that are now ecologically extinct, which means that they are so rare, their abundance is so low, that they don't exert their ecological role anymore. They are irrelevant in the ocean. They don't do what they used to do at a level that makes a difference. 90%. You have, we're talking about, imagine that you go to Africa and you saw only 10% of the animals that you would expect to see on a photo safari. This is what happened to the ocean because of overexploitation. In the last, since 1950, after the Second World War and the onset of industrialized fishing, already a third of the fisheries have collapsed, which means that, doesn't mean that there are no fish of that species that we fish in the sea, but that their abundance is so low that it's not economically sensible to go out, practical to go out and fish them. Usually scientists define collapse as the point where the abundance of fish in the sea reaches less than 10%, less than a tenth of their original abundance before industrial fishing. A third of the species that we fish have already collapsed. If we project that trend, if we continue the current trend, before 2050, most of the industrial fisheries of the world will have collapsed. So it's not going to be economically profitable. Aquaculture is coming up, but since the mid-90s, the global fish catch has been declining, despite an increase in the fishing effort, in the number of boats, heavily subsidized. So this overcapitalization of the fleet, this heavy subsidies are basically perpetuating overfishing. But because I don't want to end on a gloomy note, I want to remind you that we know what the solutions are for this one. You know, if we create these no-take marine reserves where tourism is allowed, well-regulated, where offshore farms are going to be allowed, well-regulated, we have a chance to bring this fish back, to create more jobs, to bring more money to the economy, to build resilience to climate change, and help us buy time, because we need it. We need people to feel that we are making progress. Otherwise, we will continue discounting the future, and we will not be able to get to that target of no more than 2 degrees Celsius. Thank you.